Hello, everyone. I think we'll slowly make a start, slowly just to allow a few more people to get into the webinar. I think that's most of the people out of the waiting room, though, but we'll probably find a few more join as we get going. Um, First of all, I'd just like to welcome you to the Clean Arctic Alliance's webinar addressing the Arctic heavy fuel oil ban. Are you ready for the 1st of July, 2024? I'm Sian Pryor. I'm the lead advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, which is a coalition of over 20 non-profit organizations campaigning for the protection of the Arctic from the impact of shipping activities. And I'll be moderating the webinar today. First of all, we have a couple of housekeeping matters. So please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available after today via our website. And secondly, if you have any questions, could you please try and indicate to which speaker the question is directed and submit it via the Q&A option, which I think will probably appear at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit those at any point during the webinar, but we will keep them all unless there's a reason not to, but we'll probably keep them all until the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We'll do our best to answer all the questions during the Q&A session, and hopefully there'll be time for some discussion too. Just to get us going, I just want to remind people that the Clean Arctic Alliance was established nearly 9 years ago now, bringing together a range of non-profit organizations based in the Arctic and Arctic observer countries, with the aim of seeking better protection for the Arctic, its biodiversity, and its people. The first campaign run by the Clean Arctic Alliance was the Say No to HFO campaign. It was a campaign that focused on reducing both the spill risk and black carbon emission impact of shipping on the Arctic by prohibiting the use of heavy fuel oils. A regulation introducing a ban on the use of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic was adopted 3 years ago in 2021, but there still remains more that needs to be done to ensure that the Arctic is protected from the risks of heavy fuel oil. And we're going to hear more now from our speakers on various aspects of what still needs to happen. But first of all, just to set the scene, our first speaker today will be Liana Larimore. Liana is a lawyer and a policy advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance. And she's going to, as I say, set the scene, providing an overview of Regulation 43A, the regulation introduced into MARPOL Annex I, which prohibits the use and carriage of heavy fuel oil in Arctic waters. I'll just give a moment before I hand over to Liana for the slides to come up. Let's get them back to the beginning. Okay, there we are. So, Liana, I think your first slide is up there now. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Sian. My name is Liana Larimore, and I'm an advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance. Next slide. Just as a quick summary, I'll cover the following general themes over the course of my presentation. First will be an overview of Regulation 43A of MARPOL Annex I. Then 3 challenges to the effectiveness of Regulation 43A. Then finally, several recommendations to protect the Arctic from the risks of carrying and burning heavy fuel oil, or HFO, in and near the Arctic. Next slide. So after nearly 6 years of negotiations, Regulation 43A was adopted by the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, in June of 2021. During the negotiations, we commonly referred to the final regulation as the HFO ban. But throughout this presentation, I am not going to use the phrase HFO ban to describe Regulation 43A. And this is because when the regulation goes into effect in less than a week, it will unfortunately contain a fuel tank exemption and coastal nation waiver, which will provide significant opportunities for ships to continue using and carrying heavy fuel oil in the Arctic. The exception and waiver will not expire until July 1st of 2029. I think only at that time will Regulation 43A become an actual HFO ban. So I've included the full description that the IMO used to describe its work related to Regulation 43A on this slide, under stated purpose. It's pretty wordy, and essentially the goal was to reduce the risks associated with an HFO spill in the Arctic. The initial discussions included black carbon emissions, but ultimately Regulation 43A just focused on the spill risk. And then as I note under limitations here, the final regulation reflects the singular focus and also includes a limited geographic focus, a fuel tank exemption, and a waiver, all of which ultimately results in a less effective regulation. I'll provide a little bit more detail on all of those in a bit, but first I'm going to cover what is heavy fuel oil. Next slide. So you can read the technical definition of heavy fuel oil on this slide. But basically, this says that heavy fuel oil is either very dense around room temperature or very viscous even when it's hot. On a less technical level, HFO is the world's dirtiest and most polluting fuel. It's essentially the waste product of the oil refining process. The combustion of heavy fuel oil produces high level of pollutants, which are linked to increased risk of heart disease, lung disease, and premature death. And black carbon, a type of particulate matter, is a critical contributor to human-induced climate warming, especially in the Arctic. I also just want to note that heavy fuel oil is nearly impossible to clean up due to its dense and viscous nature. For this reason, an Arctic HFO spill would present a severe risk to Arctic marine life and the indigenous communities that rely on these resources for their nutritional, cultural, and economic needs. Next slide. Okay, so let's jump into the geographic scope of Regulation 43A, why it's not broad enough to protect the Arctic from the risks of heavy fuel oil, and a recommendation for a more effective definition. So the IMO's definition of Arctic waters, which is the definition that applies to Regulation 43A, was developed to improve the safety of ships operating in ice-covered waters. And for this reason, it only encompasses Arctic waters that pose the greatest safety risk to ships. It was not created to protect the Arctic environment. Next slide. The Arctic Council also has a number of definitions of the Arctic as delineated in this figure. For example, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program established a definition of the Arctic that incorporates the Arctic Circle, various vegetation boundaries, permafrost limits, and major oceanographic features. Then other Arctic Council working groups consider emergency preparedness for oil spills or Arctic flora and fauna and their definitions of the Arctic. Next slide. But none of these definitions are specifically targeted at the regulation of shipping in the Arctic, which is why the Clean Arctic Alliance recommends that Arctic be defined in MARPOL as all Arctic waters north of 60 degrees north, and then incorporated into Regulation 43A. Next slide. The second issue in Regulation 43A is that it includes an exemption for ships with a fuel tank that is separated from the outer shell of the ship by a particular distance. These are commonly referred to as protected fuel tanks, and they're often touted as the most effective technology available to prevent oil spills from ships. And while they can definitely be effective in some circumstances, they are less effective in high-speed collisions, groundings on hard substrates or rocks, or collisions with sharp objects such as icebergs. Next slide. Finally, Regulation 43A will allow Arctic coastal nations to issue waivers for ships flying the flag of that nation while operating in waters subject to the sovereignty or jurisdiction of that nation. So, for example, the US could grant a waiver for a US flag vessel to continue using heavy fuel oil off the coast of Alaska. We, of course, hope that all Arctic coastal states will decline to issue these waivers. Next slide. So with these limitations, the question is, will Regulation 43A reduce the amount of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic? And the answer here is yes, but not by nearly as much as you would think, and it really depends on how you measure it. So the data I have up on this slide was created by the the International Council on Clean Transportation using 2019 Arctic shipping data. This first set of statistics is focused on the percentage of ships that could continue using heavy fuel oil after 2024. And after considering both the fuel tank design exemption and the waiver, almost 3/4 of the heavy fuel oil HFO fueled fleet could continue using heavy fuel oil until 2029. Then if you look at the amount of HFO carried in the Arctic, only 30% of that will be banned in 2024. And then finally, only 16% of the total percentage of the HFO being used in the Arctic waters will be prohibited in 2024. Next slide. Then I think there's questions about whether Regulation 43A will significantly reduce black carbon emissions in the Arctic. And the answer to this is no. And there's several reasons for this. The primary reason is because of the data I outlined on my previous slide. Essentially, if the majority of ships in the Arctic are permitted to continue burning heavy fuel oil until 2029, the black carbon emissions associated with burning heavy fuel oil will remain high until 2029. In fact, the International Council on Clean Transportation found that Regulation 43A would only reduce black carbon emissions by 5% until 2029. The second reason is that shipping in the Arctic is increasing. Between 2015 and 2021, black carbon emissions more than doubled as a result of increased shipping in the Arctic. And this trend is only expected to continue. Then the final reason relates to the limited geographic scope of Regulation 43A. Due to the transboundary nature of air emissions, black carbon emissions from ships operating outside of the IMO's definition of Arctic waters will be carried into the Arctic. Next slide. So what are the benefits of distillate fuels compared to HFO? Using distillate fuel is better from both a spill risk and an emission reduction perspective. Although a spill of any type of oil can cause irreversible damage to the environment, the ultimate consequences of an oil spill largely depend on the properties of the specific fuel. Distillate fuels tend to evaporate and dissolve faster than HFO, and although they're toxic, they do not emulsify on the ocean surface. Distillate fuels also tend to spread into a slick over the water surface, which allows oil recovery teams to detect and track the spill through aerial observations. On the other hand, heavy fuel oil can solidify rapidly and form into tar lumps in cold waters. These lumps do not typically float on the sea surface and can be incorporated into ocean and coastal sediments. From an emission perspective, burning distillate fuel instead of heavy fuel oil also results in significant reductions in black carbon emissions. And as you can see, the fourth greenhouse gas study from the IMO demonstrated that there are significant reductions in black carbon emissions when using distillate fuel instead of heavy fuel oil. And then installing a diesel particulate filter on ships burning distillate fuel can result in even more dramatic black carbon emission reductions. Next slide. So with all of that in mind, the Clean Arctic Alliance has the following recommendations for the IMO, individual states, and the shipping sector. First, the IMO should extend Regulation 43A to include Arctic waters north of 60 degrees north and require ships operating in and near the Arctic to immediately switch to distillate fuels and use diesel particulate matters. All states should ensure strong enforcement of Regulation 43A. Arctic coastal states should refrain from granting waivers. And finally, the shipping sector should not hide behind the use of exemptions and should instead switch to readily available cleaner fuels such as diesel, distillate, and the installation of diesel particulate filters. Next slide. And that's it for my presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Liana. And excellent. I can see some questions coming in already, which we will turn to after the presentations. I'd like to move straight on to our second speaker today, who is Ermelyn Skigel-Strand. And Ermelyn is the Senior Advisor to the International Environment Department of the Norwegian Maritime Authority. Ermelyn is going to provide some insights into Norway's approach to the HFO ban and also introduce a proposal that is being developed for submission to the 82nd session of the IMO's Marine Environment Protection Committee later this year. Over to you, Ermelyn.
Hello, thank you. Sorry, I had some problems sharing the presentation, but I think it's all right now. Right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the heavy fuel oil ban in Norway, and also a proposal that Norway is planning to send to MEPC 82 related to the heavy fuel oil ban. So yeah, as discussed before, the way that the heavy fuel oil ban is, the area that it covers follows the polar code definition of the Arctic. And I've put in a picture there that shows, and as you can see, not much of Norway really is included in the heavy fuel oil ban. It only will apply really to Svalbard, which is this archipelago north of Norway. And on Svalbard, there's already a heavy fuel oil ban in place in the Svalbard Environment Act, paragraph 82A, which prohibits the use of use and carriage of HFO by ships calling in the territorial waters around Svalbard. So this slide, I'm just going to compare the two regulations a bit. So the Svalbard Environmental Act 82A is a bit stricter than the MARPOL Annex I Regulation. First of all, it applies to use and carriage of fuel, not just use and carriage as fuel. So both as cargo as fuel. And in the Svalbard Environment Act, ships are not supposed to use or have on board petroleum-based fuel that is not basically marine gas oil. Which is in the ISO 8217 standard defined as DMA, DMX, DMZ, DFA, or DFZ. So it's a distillate requirement for ships, basically. Whilst obviously MARPOL Annex I Regulation 43A, there's a density and kinematic viscosity requirement, which is quite a lot higher than the requirement in Svalbard. Right, so next I'm going to talk about the proposal that Norway will likely be sending to MEPC 82. And the background for this proposal is some results of a project that was led by the Norwegian Coastal Administration in PAIM and EPBR, called Low Sulfur Fuels, Faith and Behavior in Cold Water Conditions. And this project has shown that that residual fuels will still be permitted in the Arctic after Regulation 43A enters into force, apart from the exemptions. So you can see here a diagram which shows viscosity and density of the very low sulfur fuel oils that was tested as part of this study, or analyzed as part of this study. And the red line shows the maximum density requirement in the heavy fuel oil ban. And so anything to the left of that line will be permitted after the regulation enters into force. And in addition, there were some ultra low sulfur fuel oils tested, all of which would be permitted after the heavy fuel oil ban enters into force. So yeah, residual fuels can still be used after. And this is the current, the current fuels being used, and it might change. There might be more fuels becoming available with a lower density in the future. The parameter that was tested in this study was the pour point of the oils. And in this diagram, you can see the pour points of high sulfur fuel oils in red. So that's the traditional 3.5% sulfur fuel oils that have been used before the 0.5% sulfur limit came into force in 2020. And then you can compare this with the newer fuels, newer low sulfur fuel oils, the VLSFO and the ULSFOs in blue and green. And as you can see, the high sulfur fuel oils have much lower pour points, generally below 0, than the new low sulfur fuel oils. So VLSFOs have quite a range of pour points. It varies quite a lot, but a substantial proportion of these oils have pour points above 10 degrees Celsius. And for the ULSFOs, most of them seem to be above 10 degrees Celsius. And these high pour points are problematic because it means that when fuel oil is then spilled into cold sea temperatures, like you find in the Arctic, they will solidify. And this, even though they might be less viscous than the traditional heavy fuel oils, then they will solidify, which also make them persistent against natural degradation and can cause long-term environmental damage. And it also reduces the effectiveness of oil combat techniques and equipment. So skimmers, for example, don't tend to work at all. And they also spread quite quickly when they are solid lumps in the water. So they spread quicker than this viscous oil slick that you get from heavy fuel oil with a lower pour point. So here, this is an example from a spill that happened in Sweden. This was just not such a big spill really from bunkering, I think. And you found these solid oil lumps all over the Oslo fjord. So in our view, only non-persistent oils should be used in the Arctic to achieve the objective of the heavy fuel or the Regulation 43A. And the reason for this is that oil spill response is a challenge in the Arctic because of the remoteness and harshness of the environment up there, and there's also a lack of people, resources, and oil response equipment. So if there is a spill, it might take a long time and be challenging to clean up. So because of this, the Arctic is dependent on nature's self-cleansing of oil spills by natural degradation and natural processes. And this is slower in the Arctic than in warmer environment or warmer areas. And residual fuel oils tend to be persistent and slower to naturally degrade than non-persistent distillate fuels. So in our view, Regulation 43A should only allow for the use of non-persistent oil that will more easily degrade in case of an oil spill. In addition to the proposal or what we've just mentioned above, another issue that we've noticed is that there's information missing from the bunker delivery notes. So of the parameters that define heavy fuel oil, only density needs to be included on the bunker delivery notes, which is, in our view, it would be beneficial to include information on viscosity and pour point as well, so that you can get a robust and consistent implementation and enforcement of Regulation 43A. And also it's useful to have this information available for improved response to fuel oil spills so that the people cleaning that up have the relevant information to know which oil they're dealing with. So Norway is planning to send a proposal to MEPC 82, depending on support from other Arctic countries, but most likely. And the following proposal will be in the document. So first of all, it's a new output to review and amend as appropriate the definition of heavy fuel oil, or of the fuel prohibited to use in carriers fuel in the Arctic. And we will also propose to amend Appendix 5 to MARPOL Annex I to ensure that all the relevant information is available on the bunker delivery note. Yeah, that was me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmeline. That was very good. Thank you. Our final speaker then for this webinar is Dr. Eleanor Tracy, who is the Senior Advisor for Sustainable Development for WWF's Global Arctic Programme. Eleanor is going to present a new WWF Arctic Programme report on the mapping of threats of using and carrying heavy fuel oils in the Arctic marine and coastal areas. And after that, we'll go to our Q&A session. So over to you, Elena.
Thank you so much for having me today. And I'm just opening up my presentation here. So my presentation will focus on the risks to marine and coastal ecosystems that come from oil spills of heavy fuel oil and residual oils that the previous presenter actually mentioned, that defined by high pour points. It is based on the recent paper published by WWF Global Arctic Programme and entitled Mapping the Threats of Carrying and Using Heavy Fuel Oil in Arctic Marine and Coastal Areas. My presentation will consist of 3 parts. First, I will talk about why residual fuels and heavy fuel oils in particular are so harmful to the Arctic. And I will actually reduce that because previous speakers have already mentioned a lot of things. Secondly, I will present some of the results of the analysis that are based on juxtaposing 2 layers of geospatial data. The first layer is shipping traffic of vessels that use residual fuels, and the second layer is a geospatial database of Arctic biodiversity features that was developed by WWF Global Arctic Program, the ArcNet database. I will zoom in 3 particular areas of concern: the bottlenecks of shipping traffic and the migration pathways of marine mammals. Thirdly, I will conclude with recommendations on how these risks and threats can be minimized. So I will actually skip this page because my colleagues, previous presenters, have already covered this, why HFOs and residual fuels are so damaging to Arctic environments. But I will mention that the fact that they're very persistent and they have a potentially extensive damage that can affect also coastal communities and the food security for indigenous peoples and other coastal communities in the Arctic. Many communities in the Arctic depend on ocean resources for a large proportion of their daily diet, and disruption and threats to those resources impact livelihoods and well-being for people in the region. So that is a particular concern. The Arctic is characterized by extreme seasonal variability that influences both human activity, shipping, and the behaviors of the animals. The impacts of oil spills on species and ecosystems varies depending on the location and seasons. Impacts can be acute, indirect, and chronic. So, speaking of specific examples on the impact, acute and chronic impacts on species, walrus populations living in proximity to shipping corridors where traffic is dense, which is in the American and Russian side of the Chukchi Sea, the Arctic Canada, in West Greenland, and the Russian side of the Barents Sea, are more vulnerable to oil spills in the summer. Moreover, because mussels, which is a walrus' preferred prey, accumulate oil-derived toxins in the long term, walrus and mussels are sensitive to the chronic and long-term impacts of water contamination. Seabirds are also more sensitive to heavy fuel oil spills than to lighter oils. Because HFO is likely to sink and coat the ground, it is particularly damaging to benthic fauna, whereas lighter oils, on the other hand, may pose a greater threat to fish populations because this can spread across larger distances. Yet because of their persistence, HFO have a more damaging cumulative impact in the Arctic. As mentioned before, the lack of marine infrastructure in most of the Arctic environments, except along the coast of Iceland, northern Norway, and northwest Russia, can delay and complicate cleanup operations. So these unique and hazardous conditions of the Arctic environments and Arctic region both increase the probability of accidents and decrease the chances for timely and effective cleanup and rescue operations, together constituting what is called a significant response gap. So now let's turn to the maps that we actually have made. The shipping traffic data included in this analysis is the Arctic Shipping Traffic Database, ISTD, provided by the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group of the Arctic Council, and it covers the years of 2021, 2022, and the first 9 months of 2023. These include different types of vessels carrying or using residual marine fuels. Fishing and tourist vessels are excluded from this analysis. The high density of vessels using HFO fuel around Iceland, coastal Norwegian areas, and then in the Barents Sea, so you can see that they are marked by more dense colors, and the areas along the northern sea route heading into the Bering Strait. There is also high traffic density of HFO and residual fuel vessels along the western coast of Greenland and in the Baffin Bay and Hudson Strait areas near Canadian coast. If we look at the numbers of ships carrying residual fuels in 2013 and then in 2023, the most populous category is cargo ships, followed by bulk carriers, those carrying large quantities of raw minerals actually, and also chemical tankers, oil products and crude oil tankers, and gas LNG tankers. Yet, if we look at the volume of HFO and residual fuels used by these vessels, it's the column, it's a graph on your right side. Gas tankers, which is LNG carriers, are clearly by far the biggest users. They're using huge amounts of fuel for propulsion. Their numbers went up from 0 in 2013 to 26 tankers in 2023. Because of this, we are seeing the increases in the using and carrying of HFO in the Arctic in recent years. So, and this slide now shows the area where these LNG tankers are very frequent, posing the high risk to biodiversity. It is the Kara Strait and the Pechora Sea area. The Kara Strait, located between the Barents and the Kara Seas, is the main shipping gate along the Northern Sea route. It has a high intensity level of traffic, which is driven primarily by the development and production of fossil fuel fields in the Yamal Peninsula, so-called Yamal LNG mega project. As of 2023, the traffic was mostly westbound, towards European ports, with Europe accounting for 80% of Russian liquefied gas sales by sea. If you look at the picture to your right, that shows the levels of conservation concern for biodiversity in this area, which is generated by the Marine Conservation Planning tool called Geranium and developed by the Global Arctic Program, the intensity of pink and purple color signals the levels of conservation concern in this area. The area is an important bottleneck for migrating of beluga whales. It is also the migration stopover and breeding grounds for king eider and Stella eider, and also summer grounds and haulout sites for walrus and other important biodiversity features. Another area which is a bottleneck for HFO shipping traffic and the migration of marine mammals is the Bering Strait area. The narrow and shallow Bering Strait, which is 85 kilometers in width and 30 to 50 meters in depth, is the only link between the Arctic and the Pacific Oceans. The shipping traffic in this area is expected to increase. Russia will be sending more oil and gas tankers to Asia using Northern Sea route. Meanwhile, the US is building maritime infrastructure, including a deep water port in Nome, which will attract more traffic to the Bering Strait area. In terms of the marine wildlife, the Bering Strait is an important bottleneck for a number of marine mammal species that migrate through the strait to the Chukchi Sea in spring and return to the Bering Sea in autumn. Species using the strait, including the bowhead whale, beluga whale, gray whale, walrus, bearded seal, and others. There is also sensitive habitats for biotopes for which the use of HFO and also the transport of oil products poses the highest level of concern. The habitats of kelp forest, benthic biomass, cold water coral communities, many species of birds, and the list really continues. The next slide shows the area between the Canadian Arctic archipelago, more known today as the Inuit Nunangat, Inuit homeland, and Greenland. The map shows the Labrador Sea, Davis Strait, Baffin Bay, and Hudson Strait. Davis Strait, between Canada and Greenland, links Baffin Bay with the Labrador Sea and North Atlantic Ocean. The area is important for migration of bowhead whales, narwhal, and beluga whales. Other habitats and biotopes for which the carriage and use of HFO posing high threats include estuaries, kelp forest, and whelping grounds for seals. The area also contains seasonal habitats for the buffing population of bowhead whales. The next slide shows the dramatic changes in bulk carriers traffic in this area in the last decade. It has been driven primarily by the development of the Mary River iron ore mining project, which commenced on Baffin Island in 2014. The iron ore is carried by bulk carriers that are using heavy fuel oil, and these vessels are also bringing a lot of underwater noise to the area. So I will move to the conclusion here. The recommendation page repeats some key recommendations of the Clean Arctic Alliance. But I would like actually to emphasize one recommendation that may not be included in their recommendation is the area-based conservation to keep ships away from sensitive marine areas and harvest sites. These measures could include route restrictions, speed reductions, areas to be avoided, and pilotage regimes to ensure safe, low-impact operation, detailed plans for shipping management, especially in the bottleneck areas where intense shipping traffic overlaps with marine mammal migration corridors. And the very last, but not the least, I would like to turn to Rachel Carson, an American scientist and environmentalist, and her book published in 1951 called The Sea Around Us, which is still very relevant. If philosophy is a footnote to Plato, then environmental protection policy is a footnote to Rachel Carson. And here's a quote: to understand the sea is to embrace its complexity and beauty, to appreciate its power and vulnerability. Really a paradoxical combination which requires us to embrace the values of respect and care. If we take this value seriously, future shipping in the Arctic should become much safer for the environment and people, eventually switching to non-polluting, non-petroleum-based propulsion. This will reduce water and air pollution, black carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and underwater radiating noise pollution all at once. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you to all of our speakers. We're now going to move to the panel session, and I'd like to ask all of the speakers to turn on your cameras, please. And I'd also like to welcome Andrew Dumbrell from Equal Routes, who is an advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance on our engagement in North America and the Northwest Passage. Please keep adding questions to the Q&A. I see there's a few there already. Hopefully you have the option. You should be able to see the option at the bottom of your screen. I'm just going to, first of all, though, bring Andrew into the conversation, and then we'll go to the questions in the Q&A. Andrew, we heard from Ermelin about Norway's approach to the Arctic heavy fuel oil ban, and I'm just wondering what you could add to that about the approach being taken in North American countries.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sean, and great presentations, everybody. I always learn so much from colleagues, even though I've been working on this for a number of years. As Sean said, my name's Andrew Dumbrell. I just live outside of Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. And I'll first talk about Canada, and you can see in the chat there, that's the official link to the Canadian regulations, and I call them regulations. They're actually, that's a bit of a misnomer. They're actually, it's an interim order that Canada is implementing. And we asked Canada, or Transport Canada, to join us today in a similar way that Norway participated. They acknowledged our invitation, but aren't attending today. So we're going to try to characterize what Canada is doing. So Canada is implementing the ban July 1st through interim orders, and they're doing full regulations in December. Part of those interim orders, as you can see in that link, are to grant waivers to community resupply for Canadian flagged community resupply, and to allow the exemptions which have been articulated mainly by Liana earlier on. And so first, it's very positive that Canada is implementing the ban. Ultimately, the main reason for exempting the Canadian resupply fleet is to ensure that costs associated with the ban from switching away from heavy fuel oil to distillate fuels don't burden communities. The best solution around that, obviously, is to develop some kind of cost mitigation strategy framework, which many Indigenous communities have been calling for a number of years. That's not in place yet. And the Canadian government has said that these Canadian resupply vessels will be able to apply for waivers until July 1st, 2026. So it's giving them time to put in that cost mitigation strategy. Those community resupply vessels will still be carrying and using HFO and will be transiting close, if not right into communities. So it's very important that these ships also switch away to distillate fuels, cleaner alternatives. So that's the situation in Canada. And it's also really a good segue from Elena's presentation. You saw the dramatic increase in bulk traffic associated with the Baffinland mine. And Baffinland can mandate its ships to use distillate fuel tomorrow, right? So there is an onus on a good corporate actors like Baffinland to mandate that for their service vessels. And I should also say that FedNav, the shipping coordinator for the Baffinland mine, just released their yearly report, and it shows a dramatic increase in the use of HFO, 60% increase from 2022 to 2023. So it's the trend, the exact opposite trend we want to see in Canada. There's an intense increase in traffic, and shipping, Canada's largest bulk carrier, FedNav, is going in the opposite direction. So there's a place here for corporate social responsibility in mandating and switching away from heavy fuel oil. So I'll just transition to the US. And in the US, our understanding is that the administration is implementing the HFO ban without waivers in US waters. And also, we were going to put a call out to anybody else on the call today. We thought maybe someone from the Netherlands. Netherlands is one of the top 10 flags that are operating in the Arctic, and we're curious about non-coastal states and their plans for implementing the HFO ban as well. So that's just a general call to anybody on the webinar if they want to speak up about their administrative plans. So I think I'll pass it back to you, Sean. Yep.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, as Andrew says, and actually it relates, I think, to the last question that's in the Q&A from Ana Teresa Cardosa, who's asking about feedback from maritime administrations on the guidelines given to their fleets about the changes. I'll come to the question in order in a minute, but I noticed that in the attendees, there are some people who represent different countries' administrations. If anyone would like to update on what they are planning to do in their own respective country, just drop us a note in the Q&A and we can add you as a speaker, just to say a few words about your plans. But I think we'll just give people time to think about that, and we'll turn to the first questions that have been asked. And the first couple of questions come from Tom Washington. And Tom has asked how much heavy fuel oil is being carried in, for example, tons per year in the Arctic up until now, and what change do we expect to see in the volumes beyond after the 1st of July? I don't have volume data at my fingertips, but there has been a lot of work done on the volumes of heavy fuel oil carried in the Arctic, both by the International Council on Clean Transportation and by the Arctic Council's Pay and Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, who've issued reports. And I think there are good figures on how much HFO is being used currently. And from Liana's presentation and the work done by ICCCT a few years ago now, the predictions are that it's not going to drop significantly. I don't know if any of our speakers would like to come in and add to those questions. And certainly if anyone's interested, we can make sure that those reports are all available. They're all on ICCT or the Arctic Council's website, so they're widely available, and we can put the links in. I don't know if I can get them into the chat actually that people can see, but we can make them available. Would anyone like to add anything?
Yeah, this is Liana Larimore. I can just add that if we're looking at volume of HFO carried in the Arctic, it looks like the ICCT is only anticipating a 30% reduction post July 1st.
Thank you, Liana.
I can also add maybe a few things here, if you don't mind. Yes. So those are the projections taking into account the current trend. But if we really look at the largest type, the largest use of HFO, those are as I mentioned, gas tankers and LNG tankers. They really they're using a lot of HFO in volume. And so the introduction of new tankers in Arctic waters increase the volume almost immediately. And so we are going to see more of oil and gas project developments in certain places in say in Russian Arctic, and the increase of the use of LNG tankers there, then the volume of HFO use will go up as well.
Thank you. Tom, I don't know that we've answered your question exactly, but hopefully that gives you an indication of the volumes that are being used and the fact that the volumes are increasing. And in terms of how much will be used after 1st of July, a little bit remains to be seen. And, we are urging the shipping companies to act responsibly and to choose to move to alternative options, alternative fuels. The next question we've got comes from Gloria Dickey. And actually some of her question, I think, was answered during one of the presentations. But she's asking, why do shipping companies want to use heavy fuel oils over distillate fuels? Is it purely down to the cost issue, or is there an availability issue as well? So who's going to jump in here? Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Gloria, for the question. And many ships that use HFO do a global trade and often go in and out of emission control areas. Therefore, they have fuel in different fuel tanks for different purposes. In emission control areas, often ships have to switch to distillate fuels because of those regulations. It's fairly straightforward for the switch to happen, is what I'm saying, and ships do it all the time in and out of emission control areas. Distillate fuels are available throughout the globe, and there's been an analysis at the IMO which shows that it's the fuel availability study which just shows that distillate fuel is available. So ships don't need to retrofit or do anything expensive to use distillate, cleaner fuels, and fuels are available globally. It's primarily a cost issue. HFO is the cheapest of the cheap, and distillate fuels, cleaner fuels, are more expensive. However, when you look at, there was an analysis a couple of years ago by ICCT that looked at the Baffinland mine, for instance, which looked at scenarios about switching to distillate in their transits from the Canadian Arctic to Europe and back again. And it showed, a less than 1% implication on the bottom line of that trade by switching to distillate fuels. So even though they are more expensive, it's manageable within the cost of doing business. So it really, there aren't many, if any, barriers to switching away from HFO to cleaner fuels, especially if you weigh the consequences. You look at the black carbon emissions, health implications, climate implications, biodiversity implications of a consequential spill. If you weigh that against some of those costs issues, the choice is clear, at least from our perspective. So yes, it's available. Ships can do it easily, and they really need to get on with it. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything more to that? No? I'm going to move on to our next question then. And actually, I'm going to ask Ermelin a question at the same time, if I may. What the next question actually comes from Anna Teresa Cardosa, who is asking whether we have any feedback from maritime administrations on the guidelines given to their fleets ahead of the changes. And I'll say again, if anyone wants to come in and just offer what's happening in other countries, please feel free to just highlight in the Q&A that you're interested in speaking. But Ermelin, I was interested to know a little bit more about what was the driver behind Norway deciding to go for a heavy fuel oil ban in the waters around Svalbard sooner, because that ban's in place already and has been for, I think, 2 or 3 years now. And actually there was a ban, although it wasn't as comprehensive even before that, I believe.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, it has been. There was a distillate requirement in place before, but only in the protected areas, and then recently it was expanded so that it now covers all of the territorial waters of Svalbard. But it did cover most of it already before. The reason behind it was because of the limited oil pollution preparedness resources that you have in the Arctic, and also the fact that it's a fragile ecosystems, and so there was the opinion that you needed to protect, the nature up there by only allowing fuels that would not be persistent. That was the background for it. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Nobody's offering to come in from the audience as yet and tell us more about what they're doing, but we still have some questions here. Aaron Brackle has asked what happens to the dirtiest fraction of crude oil if it's not going to be used as heavy fuel fuel. Would anyone like to respond to that? I'll say a little bit to start things off if you would like. There are other uses of heavy fuel oil. As I understand it, it's not something we specialize in because they're not in the shipping sector. But I believe that the residual fuels can be used in terms of road making and I forget what you call it, but the materials that are put onto roofs, to creosote type materials that are put onto roofs. So I think there are other avenues for heavy fuel oil use, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to start moving away from using oils in this way. So, there is a concern, obviously, that from some quarters that there won't be a market anymore for residual fuels, but I don't think that's necessarily the case right now. But actually, at the end of the day, we do need to start decarbonising. Andrew, I can see you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, just quickly, my understanding, talking to some fuel experts and refining experts, is that it's not a given that HFO is produced in the refining process. So that can be changed and tweaked like other manufacturing businesses. So, and I'm in no way an expert on this at all, but I just to say that it doesn't necessarily have to be a byproduct. I think there are other ways to approach fuel refining. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, as I understand it, I mean, you can continue to treat the fuels and clean them up and break them down into and turn them into cleaner fuels, but it becomes increasingly expensive with that residual fuel that's left after the distillation process. So next question then, a couple more questions have come in. One from Manuel Pallister. It sounds from an actual reality perspective that things are not getting done as they should be for the Arctic from all the speakers. We've heard this. So how do we move forward now to action that is really going to lead to change? Who would like to start off? I'm sure everyone should probably have some thoughts around this.
just waiting waiting for others. I mean, I can.
You go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll be quick to allow others some time. Ultimately we have to decarbonize. I think everybody realizes that. And I think, distillate fuel is a short-term solution here because of all the reasons that we outlined and the availability, around the world. It also allows for diesel particulate filters to further reduce black carbon emissions. It's not the ultimate solution, though, right, on our step towards decarbonization. I think there is a role for corporate social responsibility here and for good actors to show leadership and to communicate that leadership. And as I mentioned with, the Baffinland mine or FedNav, they're well placed to show that leadership, even though there are loopholes and shortcomings in many of the regimes, around the Arctic. So it's not all, it shouldn't be, the burden shouldn't be placed all on coastal state administrations. There is a role for leadership here from industry actors. And also, in this period to 2030, wind propulsion and efficiency, along with switching to distillate, is one of the recipes to meet the new, greenhouse gas targets that the IMO has set. And those they don't involve, the fuels of the future, the green hydrogens or the like. Those are all things that we can implement fairly quickly. So the switch to distillate is part of that package to get to 2030. So that's the kind of short-term vision that we see. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. And Elena, I think your hand's up.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. You really covered a lot of things that I wanted to mention, but I agree with you that it has to be approached holistically. And decarbonization, broadly speaking, not just of the shipping sector, but generally speaking of the society and world economy, and decreasing demand for fossil fuels that will eventually require, phasing out of these oil and gas projects in the Arctic that are driving actually the increase in tankers and oil shipping and so forth. So this is a way to go, and the values as well, especially DORA values embrace the indigenous and coastal peoples, values of respect and stewardship of the marine environment. Those things are important, and of course the leadership.
Malin, go ahead.
Thanks. So I've mentioned this before already, but in our view, it's important to at least start with improving the current HFO ban by making sure that the persistent oils, all of them, are included in the ban, and make sure that you also have the information available for proper enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a really important first step, isn't it? And one thing that perhaps hasn't been said yet today is that actually, when you look at the numbers of ships using HFO, they're in the minority. There's still a lot, and it's still a significant percentage. But actually, there are more ships operating in the Arctic already on distillates, showing that it can be done. They tend to be the smaller ships, so the volumes of heavy fuel oil that they're carrying aren't as big. And so when you look at the volumes of oil being used in the Arctic, the majority of it is heavy fuel oil. But it does show that it can be done, and we just need to scale this up so that all the ships are moving stepwise towards cleaner fuels and towards a decarbonised future. One last question, and I think we're actually just running slightly over time, so we'll wrap up after this. I don't have a quick answer to this one. I don't know if anyone else does. Raya Koch has asked, is it true that MGOs are cheaper than heavy fuel oils if scrubbers are being used? Now, obviously, there's the investment cost of placing a scrubber, and I know there's been work done recently that shows that scrubber costs can be recovered very quickly, certainly in under 5 years, and sometimes as low as 1 year, I believe. But whether that cost on top of the savings by being able to carry on using HFO is cheaper, is more expensive than using MGOs, I can't say off the top of my head, but maybe somebody else would like to offer some thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is Leona Larimore. I would just say I would anticipate that it probably very much depends on exactly where the ship is operating, what the cost of the fuel is there. And yeah, I anticipate that it's probably pretty fact specific for each ship. There are obviously many shipping companies that are choosing to install scrubbers and continue burning heavy fuel oil instead of switching to distillate. So, you know, certainly those companies have done the cost analysis for themselves and have decided to move forward with a scrubber. But also there are others that are making a different decision. So I think it probably just depends.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap us up then. Thank you to all of our speakers. I think we need to, I just want to remind everyone that the webinar has been recorded and we will make it available after today. The details will be circulated, particularly for those people who registered but were unable to attend. Next Monday, the 1st of July, I think is a momentous day for the protection of the Arctic. As from this date, heavy fuel oil will no longer be allowed to be carried as fuel or used on board ships operating in Arctic waters unless they have protected fuel tanks or a waiver has been issued. Clearly, we still need to do more, though, that we haven't got the answer through this regulation in terms of the risks posed to the Arctic from heavy fuel oil. So as has been said already, what the Clean Arctic Alliance is wanting to see is strict implementation and enforcement of the ban when it takes effect on the 1st of July. Full compliance, obviously, with the new requirement by all ships operating in the Arctic. And I think we have to commend Norway, who recently fined a master and company who were caught still carrying heavy fuel oil while in Svalbard's waters. It was in media about a week or so ago. As I mentioned earlier as well, we'd like to see an extension to the area that the ban covers. We think it would be valuable to extend it to cover all of the waters north of 60 degrees north, so the whole Arctic. And we call on the shipping fleets of the world to follow the spirit of the regulation and not hide behind the use of exemptions. We really need to see this measure in place now, sooner, not later. I think only in this way can the Arctic begin to be protected in a meaningful way. So I'd just like to finally thank all of our speakers. I apologize, I see there's a couple more questions come in, but we'll follow up on those separately. I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, Liana, Ermelin, Elena, and Andrew for joining the panel. Finally, I'd like to just thank all of you, the participants as well, for joining us today. I hope you found the discussion useful and valuable. And if you want to follow up, you can contact us on the information provided on this final slide. And I'd like to wish everyone an excellent rest of the day. Thank you.